Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. Welcome to this webinar. We're just going to give 1 or 2 minutes for more people to join, and then we'll make a start. But you should all see a 0 page, so you know you're in the right place. It's very exciting for us to be launching this today, and we know that many of you were on a waiting list, so sorry about this, but it will be recorded so you can pass it on later to people that you know couldn't make it, and you can also just contact us if you have any questions. Right, I'll just give 1 more minute for people to join in, and then we'll make a start. For those interested as well, you should all see in the chat function a link that has appeared to download the FAQs from the LETI or CIBSE websites.
What do you think? Should we start, Julie?
Yeah, I think we should start now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. I'm Julie Godefroy, Head of Sustainability at CIBSE, and there is also Clara Bagner-George.
Hi, I'm Clara Bagner-George from, I work at Elementor Consulting, but I'm here representing LETI.
So we are launching the result of several months of work together as CIBSE and LETI, and with many organizations across industry and many of you who contributed to our work. So we're very excited to launch this because it's not only a CIBSE and LETI piece of work, it's now supported by the ISTRAC-T, the RIBA, RICS, the BRE, the Good Homes Alliance, and the Whole Life Carbon Network, which is really very exciting for us, which means we have key members of a project team working on the same understanding of what net zero means in practice. In addition, we have done a lot of industry engagement, much of it with many of you who contributed to our survey and commented on the earlier drafts, and we will keep engaging. So thank you to everybody who has contributed already.
And it's so good as LETI to see all the, a lot of the professional institutions collaborating together on this. I'm really pleased. So yeah, we're really excited that the publication is finally ready, and so please do download it for free. It's available on the LETI and on the CIBSE website, and we'd be really grateful if you could share it on socials using our hashtag #WhatIsZero, so we can promote this guidance to everybody. So just a little bit about LETI, for those of you who don't know who we are. We are a group of built environment professionals that have been working together for, I suppose, the last 5 years now to try and move the UK's building stock to zero carbon. We've done quite a lot of work in this area over the last 5 years. So in 2020, we published our Climate Emergency Design Guide and our operational net zero one-pager, as well as our embodied carbon primer, which outlined, as we saw at the time, what operational net zero was and how to get there. We also followed that up with in May 2021 with some more information on embodied carbon and whole life carbon, and did a piece of work called our carbon alignment piece together with Whole Life Carbon Network and ISTRAC-T to really understand and to bring together, and RIBA to bring together our embodied carbon targets. And then Whole Life Carbon Network produced this really useful guidance on carbon definitions that LETI supported and have adopted that provide clarity on what we mean when we talk about a zero carbon. And that was really a starting point for this FAQs piece of work, was a kind of companion piece to that carbon definitions document.
We at CIBSE, we also have quite a lot of guidance around net zero, some of it directly relating to it and some of it which is obviously much more technical guidance on the implementation. We know that a problem members have often with our guidance is not only the content, but how to find it. So if you don't already know, we have a dedicated net zero guidance page, which we've had for a couple of years now. You have a link here, and it's updated really regularly for you to know the latest pieces of guidance that we have, as well as some of the working groups, for example, on embodied carbon, on electrification for net zero, and it's all structured according to the same steps as the LETI one-pager. So whether you come at it from a CIBSE or a LETI angle, hopefully you'll find it easier to find our guidance.
So as I mentioned just now, our kind of starting point for this work was the whole life carbon network definitions, and CIBSE and LETI have been collaborating over the last 6 months or so to really put together this set of FAQs which accompanies the definitions and really make sure that they're applied consistently and robustly. If you want to have a look at this document, do go to leti.london/carbon alignment. It's important to say, with all this topic, it's an evolving document, and updates will be on that website.
So CIBSE at the time of the definitions didn't adopt them, but it's not so much that we didn't agree with them, but we thought that it needed, first of all, a bit more interrogation in the detail, because that's what CIBSE like, and also because we really wanted to do some engagement with our members on some of the technical points, and also to make sure that it wasn't just a decision taken from the CIBSE point of view, but that everybody knew that it was happening, could express an opinion, etc. And some of the questions that we had in our mind, for example, were how the definitions worked, for example, in the case of district heating networks, what our members thought about what the role of offsets should be and offsite renewables, what they thought about the definitions in terms of having embodied carbon and energy use targets, but also what these targets should be, whether we should have definitions that worked from now on until 2050, or whether the definitions could evolve as the grid decarbonizes, etc. So we had a lot of questions, and LETI, when we talked to them, we both thought, okay, let's do some sort of FAQs and engagement exercise at the same time. One of the outcomes is that I'm really happy to say that CIBSE have now adopted the definitions. It just took us longer than everybody else to do so, but it's now official. So we are all working to the same definition of what zero is. Net zero. As I've said, one of the pieces that we did is to have an industry survey. So once, first of all, we asked opinions on what sort of questions people had when they wanted to apply the net zero definitions. Then we had a first draft of the FAQs and a big survey in November, December around COP, which received quite a lot of interest. I think many of you have answered it. And it was to test both what we were saying and whether the format of an FAQ would work for people. Next, please. We received quite a lot of interest. It was a long and detailed survey, so thank you very much for everyone who spent time on it. We had nearly 200 full responses and many more who engaged partially with it. What's quite good is that really the range of disciplines involved in the survey responses was quite large. As you can see, we had a lot of architects, as well as building services engineers, modelers, sustainability consultants, etc. And we asked people to indicate their level of expertise, both in operational and embodied carbon. And again, we had quite a mix, but a very good proportion of people who considered themselves to have medium or expert levels, so we're quite happy with the inputs received. What this has led us to, and that's the document you can now download, is this set of FAQs. We will just go through a few today, but essentially the document is structured into parts. This first, what we call the key FAQs, and that's really the big questions that come up the most often, that are the most important, the most influential, etc. And they are organized in first a section on operational energy, embodied carbon, offsets, what we call net zero claims, which we'll cover today, and net zero whole life carbon. And then we have a shorter section on more detailed FAQs. So once you get to the nitty-gritty, for example, there are some very detailed calculations of what we call residual emissions or embodied carbon, and questions that come up actually quite often, but which are, say, less strategic. And these are at the end of the document.
So when we talk about net zero carbon, we're talking about whole life carbon, and we break that up into operational energy and embodied carbon. So first, we're going to go through some key FAQs around operational energy. Now, the definition that we're working with is really clear. It's quite long, I would say. We're going to break it up a little bit, and by the time we get to the end of this, if you're new to this, I'm sure it will be much clearer. But we're looking at an asset where there's no fossil fuels used on site. All energy use, so that's regulated and unregulated, has been minimised, and we're meeting local energy use targets. And all energy is generated on or off-site using renewables that demonstrate additionality, and direct emissions from the renewables and upstream emissions are offset. We'll talk about these upstream emissions later on. So what do we mean by the local targets? So we've got energy use intensity and energy ratings. So, you know, it was fantastic, overwhelming consensus. 91% of those consulted on agreed that buildings need to meet these energy use targets or an energy rating. And then 75% agreed that we need a space heating or cooling target. So within the FAQs, we are saying that we must have an energy use intensity or an energy rating, and we're strongly recommending a space heating and space cooling demand target. So why do we need an energy target? Well, how does that relate to net zero? So in the UK, we have a finite budget of renewables. So we have a finite amount of renewables that will be generating electricity in 2030 and by 2050. And we need to make sure that this is distributed equitably in our building stock. So we're only going to achieve net zero at scale across the whole UK if each building is using their fair share of that renewables. And that's what creates our energy budgets, which informs our energy targets or our energy rating. So how is an energy use intensity calculated? So energy use is all energy used or required by a building supplied to the building, and that's for space heating demand, space heating consumption, domestic hot water, cooling, pumps, lighting, plug loads, so regulated and unregulated uses divided by the floor area. Now, depending on the building type, that might be in GIA or NLA. So it's a measure of the building's performance that you can build predictive energy models that predict it in design, and you can easily meter and measure it once the building has been completed. Now, what's really important to realise is that, you know, renewable energy is really, really important, of course, but whether or not you have renewable energy doesn't affect your energy use intensity. So it doesn't include that benefit of renewables within it, because it's really important that first we get our energy consumption low and we're meeting that energy budget. So hopefully that's a lot clearer.
Thank you. I forgot to say, please don't forget to put your questions in the questions box. I can see one has already, but don't forget, I should have said that at the start, sorry. So as Clara said, it's really important that in addition to zero carbon supplies, buildings have applied demand reduction and energy efficiency, and that they meet energy targets. One question we did have, and which we asked in our FAQs and initial survey, is, right, that applies to buildings that essentially rely on the system, because it's not we're not only considering buildings, the system cannot decarbonize if every building doesn't do their bit. But what about buildings that are not connected to the system? Could you potentially argue that actually they shouldn't be required to meet any sort of demand reduction or energy use targets? And we were really pleased because actually most people supported very much that these buildings, even off-grid, should be subject to an energy use and demand reduction targets. And there were several arguments put forward for that in the responses. Some people said, well, if they were more energy efficient, even if they have their own site systems, they could share with others. So it still ultimately means that there's a demand that needs to be met that wouldn't have otherwise. The other argument is that the more energy used, the higher the peaks, the larger the systems, and therefore the embodied carbon in these systems in order to meet energy demand. So the answer is that at the moment, the FAQ says even if you're not connected to a grid and you don't rely on the system, you should still meet these targets.
And it's important to note that the definition talks about local targets, and that's because the definition is relevant to various countries. But in the UK, we have LETI targets for space heating demand and energy use intensity, and we have that for resi, office, and schools. And for offices, also there's the UK Neighbours 6-star rating, and the REBA 2030 challenge. So the 2030 targets are also all aligned with that. So we have the targets ready for some typologies, and we are looking at collaborating with others to develop more targets for more typologies this year.
Another question that we were hoping to answer, and which unfortunately we haven't quite answered, but we've progressed in still, is how to apply these targets and the net zero definition in general for buildings that are connected to district heating networks. One of the questions is how to do when the district heating network uses fossil fuels, and that's a question we'll look into a bit later in more detail. But even without this, how do you apply an energy use target? So we gave options to people. For example, should you have option one would be you only consider the building and you sort of have an adjusted energy use target, which is essentially just your thermal demand plus your allowance for electrical uses. Option two was that option plus some performance criteria on the network. Option three was actually you don't change it, you apply exactly the same energy use target, and you have to count all your distribution losses from the network, distribution and generation losses. All of these options have pros and cons, and essentially the responses were completely split between option two and option three. Most people, really in large majority, think we cannot ignore district heating networks. We shouldn't have targets that only look at the building, because maybe it makes it easier for buildings that don't have a choice to connect to a network, but on the other hand, it means that somehow we never address the efficiency and the carbon impact of networks. So the split was how to address these networks, whether as a single target or as different components. And that's clearly a really important area of work for us at the moment. I'm sorry we can't give you an answer today, but it's very much in our next steps. So if you are interested in or have thoughts or recommendations, let us know. And finally, another question we had was whether we should have definitions today that work and will work in 2050, because people think that they need to know now and it shouldn't change and we need stability in what is going to be required, or whether actually people are quite flexible and they understand that the definitions may change. And that was, again, to me at least, quite surprising in that most people understand and are quite happy for the definition to evolve in the future. And in particular, they think that the same components should remain. So an energy target, renewable on-site generation, and if needed, procurement, offset of the upstream remaining emissions, but probably an additional element to do with demand management, whether it's a peak demand limit or some sort of indicator of demand flexibility. Clearly, there's an understanding that this is going to become more and more important, and that as a result, the requirements associated with the definitions may evolve.
So we've touched on our operational energy, and we're going to give a bit of time to embodied carbon. So the definitions are pretty clear. For upfront, so we like to split the terminology for upfront embodied carbon, and that's the carbon emissions associated with materials and construction process up to practical completion. So that's, for those who know the lingo, modules A1 to A5. And then for embodied carbon, or sometimes we call it life cycle embodied carbon, that's the whole life cycle. So that's the total embodied carbon emissions associated with the A1 to A5 and the in-use stages, so B1 to B5, and the end-of-life stages, C1 to C4. And it's important to note with upfront embodied carbon, especially when we go to those targets, upfront embodied carbon targets, there we're excluding biogenic carbon sequestered for this stage. This diagram really helpfully explains that in a bit more detail. And if you want to peruse that at your leisure, do have a look at the definitions document. So what about net zero? A net zero upfront carbon asset is one where the sum of the greenhouse gas emissions is minimised, and you're meeting these local carbon targets. And with the additional, so the embodied carbon that you've got in your asset then needs to equal zero with offsets. And similarly, when if you want a net zero embodied carbon asset, you need to reduce the embodied carbon, meet the targets, and then balance that again with offsets, so you're equal zero. So what embodied carbon targets do we have? So LETI collaborated with Whole Life Carbon Network, REBA and ISRT last year to come to a kind of some carbon alignment, as I mentioned earlier, on the targets. So we now have this A++ to G rating for upfront embodied carbon and life cycle embodied carbon for 4 typologies. So, what does good look like, right? So we're saying that for buildings that you're designing now, good is achieving a target of a C rating, and very good is a B rating. So that's a good stretch target for buildings that are designed now. But if you're thinking about buildings that are constructed, by, let's say, 2030, then you need to be achieving a B rating, and designed in 2030, achieving an A rating. So why does a building need to meet these upfront embodied carbon targets? It's because it's similar to the how when we talked about operational energy, where we said there's a finite renewable resource, and we need to make sure that our buildings are using only their equitable fair share of that. In a similar way, we have a finite carbon budget for the UK so that we meet our climate change targets, and that means we have a certain amount of carbon that we've got to spend, and we can't spend any more. And that helps us understand what those carbon targets that align with zero are. I suppose it's important to note we haven't really said exactly what rating is aligned with achieving net zero, and that's because that's kind of slightly underway. So we're collaborating and working with UK GBC. They've done some great work on the Whole Life Carbon Roadmap last year, and we'll be using that to work out this year what rating does align with net zero. But don't let that hold you back. As I said before, we know how we're defining good now, which is in design phase a C with a stretch target of a B. So if you're working on design projects, aim for that. Another question we were asked is, why is the target not 0 kilograms of carbon per metre squared? Well, that's because in our, given the buildings that we're working on, to achieve that zero, that would be a building that is made from 100% reused or 100% natural materials with no carbon associated with creating those materials or manufacturing or transportation, which isn't really feasible for the types of buildings that the majority of us are designing in the industry. So that's why we've got these targets that are going to be set based on our carbon budgets, and then we need to offset to get to zero. So we've talked about separately the operational energy and the embodied carbon, but what about whole life carbon? So if you want to be net zero whole life, you need to be, fossil fuel free on site, so no burning of gas and oil. You've got to meet your space heating demand target, meet your energy use target. You need to be having on-site renewables or off-site renewables, meeting your water target, and then you need to be meeting your upfront and your life cycle embodied carbon target. There's lots of targets that need to be met before you start thinking about offsets, and that's really, offsets is just for unavoidable emissions. That's just upstream emissions, the embodied carbon and the carbon associated with water use. So I hear you thinking, she's been saying this upstream word quite a lot. What does that mean? So we've got a quite hefty pages in the FAQs under FAQ 21 to really get into the detail of what we mean by upstream emissions and how to calculate them. So in this diagram, you can see a building that's got some on-site renewables, but it's connected to the grid. And, we're used to kind of thinking about direct emissions. We're used to thinking about the gas that's burnt in a building or the electricity that's used in a building, and they have direct emissions. But there are also other emissions that we need to think about, which we call upstream emissions. And it's really important that we capture these, especially when we move to net zero. So when we remove the gas and when we reduce our energy consumption, increase our renewables, suddenly those upstream emissions become very large because they're the only emissions that actually exist. So we need to make sure that we're capturing them and calculating them and offsetting them. So the upstream emissions include your well to tank emissions from your electricity generation. And they also include your losses through your electricity transmission, and it includes also the well to tank of those losses. So what's really helpful is that in the FAQs, we've got lots of various different cases, and we're explaining exactly what factors need to be used when you're doing the kind of number crunching around what the unavoidable upstream emissions are and how much you need to offset.
So far we've mostly talked about technical questions, but a really important part of the questions we regularly receive and still ask ourselves is, what about all the buildings that can't quite meet all of these requirements? How much flexibility should we provide? How much should we acknowledge some sort of progress, some sort of constraints, which means they can't meet all the requirements, particularly for existing buildings, but not only. So we did some thinking about it. We asked questions in the draft FAQs and our industry survey. And really, this was a very, very useful area because we had overcomplicated things. But also the survey showed, generally speaking, quite a strong steer for what people should be a reasonable balance between acknowledging constraints for some buildings, especially existing buildings and buildings that are requested to connect to a district energy networks. These were two areas where the majority of respondents felt that some sort of acknowledgement to the constraint was required. There was really not majority support for acknowledging other types of constraints, for example, landlord and tenant relationships. And there the arguments were that first, the more sub-cases and flexible options we introduce, the more there's a risk for greenwash. and people who just claim something when actually the building hasn't done that much so far. And also because it's a little bit like networks. The more we give flexibility to, say, landlord and tenant relationships, the less we encourage landlords and tenants to speak to each other. So at the moment, what our FAQs offer are, I think, important flexibility areas, but only in some limited cases. This may evolve as we do more industry engagement, but this is where we thought that in majority at the moment, the responses were. In addition, we also suggest that you could acknowledge buildings that are still in the process of being designed or built to the net zero requirements, and which just cannot show at the moment how they evidence. We propose to call all of that net zero in progress, or NZIP, as has been suggested. And so basically the cases at the moment where we think you could call the building net zero in progress, in the case of operational energy, is if you're at the design stage or if you're built but not yet operating, but you have applied all the design and construction measures to meet the energy use target, you are not planning to use fossil fuels, you have plans for your offsetting and renewable energy procurement. So that's just a matter of project stage. Then the two flexibility areas are for existing buildings where you cannot yet meet the energy use target, but there is a retrofit plan in place to meet that target in the future. Similarly, you could call yourself net zero in progress if, as a building, you're connected to an energy network, you meet the building's energy use target, and the network, we've lost Clara, or I've lost Clara, hopefully she'll come back, sorry. She's back. But the network has a decarbonization plan in place that would allow the building to meet all net zero requirements. So for example, it may have a plan already to move from gas plant to a heat pump to improve its energy efficiency, etc. And these two requirements for existing buildings to have a retrofit plan in place, or for networks to have a decarbonization plan in place, were really quite strong in the feedback. They said, okay, acknowledge constraints, offer flexibility, but it has to be as a step for further improvements, not just an end in itself. On the embodied carbon side, in a way, it's a little bit simpler because you spend the embodied carbon or you don't. And so the flexibility areas to call yourself net zero in progress really are related to your project stage. So depending on whether you're just at the design stage or built but not yet operating. And there you could meet your targets at the design or as-built stage and have your offset requirements covered. Another way to express it, but it's the same, is that the FAQs show that along a timeline. So for example, in the case of operational carbon, to call yourself net zero in progress, you can do that according to various criteria at the design stage or built but not yet operating. And then for existing buildings, if they have that retrofit plan in place, or for buildings connected to non-compliant networks. So these are the only options at the moment that we think are a reasonable balance. We're coming to the end of the presentation and we have lots of questions in the box, so thank you. But we'll just tell you a little bit more about what we're going to do next, because as you can see, there's things we haven't yet answered. The big ones really are that to continue work on energy targets. So as Clara said, we already have energy targets for new buildings, for offices, schools and resi. And we're starting to work with lots of organizations in industry on extending these targets to other sectors. Also doing more work on targets for existing buildings and how to introduce exactly that flexibility. So for example, an existing building that calls itself net zero in progress, it still probably should have some form of requirements, not just call itself in progress without any energy consideration. And as I've said, we need to work on how to address buildings connected to heat networks and that issue of energy targets. Similarly, there are embodied carbon targets proposed by LETI and supported by the ISTRUCT, but we probably need to do a bit more work on this, including industry engagement works, to arrive at targets that we think are net zero compatible and achievable. So if you're interested to contribute to any of these areas, please contact us. And we really want to build consensus. We know that it's difficult enough to achieve net zero, let alone if there's all sorts of contradictions all over the place from different organizations. So if you want to talk about how you could support us to build consensus or anything, please get in touch.
And I think it's important to note, if you've completed the consultation in November, December, you might be reading the documents and you might be thinking, I thought CIBSE and LETI would provide more definitive answers on some of these kind of tricky or thorny questions. But I suppose what we've realised is, this is a first step in, or a next step, let's say, in providing clarity. But actually, we need to go beyond LETI and CIBSE. We need to engage others in getting clarity on those key details. And so that's what we're doing. So, although we publish this now, we're going to be continuing to work with others this year to develop clarity on some of those issues.
Great. So we have lots of questions in already. We'll try to answer as many as we can, but I'm pretty sure that we won't be able to answer them all. Keep them coming because we can add them later on our website. It can also contribute to our plan for future FAQs and anything. So please don't worry if your question is not answered today. I'll pick one first for Clara to answer, and then we'll alternate, if that's okay. So the first question is from Michelle Wang. I note that this set of definitions are supported by most institutions. Are there plans to align this with the UK GBC's net zero approach and targets? There are slight differences in scope. I think that's a great question because the GBC framework is used quite a bit, and we can tell you a little bit about slight areas of differences.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly what I suppose we were alluding to when we said we need to go beyond CIBSE and LETI. So that's what we're really hoping to do this year, is support, is work with those other groups like UK GBC to work out whether there are tiny, I don't know, there are small differences, but I think that we can iron out them together, and that's the plan for this year. Sorry, Julie, I can't actually see our questions, so I'm not sure.
So Juliet in the background, if she could make sure that Clara can see the question. So another one, which I think, Clara, you're really well placed to answer, is from David Tolley. Can you share the list of EUI targets for various buildings, or is there a UK average? So we can tell you a bit about how we got to that.
Yeah, so we've got that for residential buildings, offices, and schools. So what we've done is, this was a part of it. You can access it using the LETI website. The Climate Emergency Design Guide outlines those targets, and effectively we've done a bit of that analysis, like we said. So we've done some top-down analysis, understanding the renewables that are available, and understanding the floor space of those different typologies, and also some bottom-up analysis of understanding how far could we go in terms of energy reductions. We've also looked at in-use performance of kind of really high-performing buildings that are actually live, and we're gathering data on, and understanding that the general benchmarks as well. So we've done this top-down, bottom-up, and basing it in the real world, and that's how we've developed those targets. But yeah, go to www.leti.london/CEDG.
Yes. Can you see the questions now, or should I keep picking them?
I think I can see them, but I would say there's a good, interesting question from Paul saying that too many manufacturers simply do not yet have embodied carbon information available? Are we to write off most of the suppliers? What do you think, Julie?
Absolutely not. That's true. So what we both advocate, LETI and CIBSE, is that first we should ask. So you should ask these manufacturers, hi, do you have an environmental product declaration for your product, just to show there's a demand, because until they're confident that it's worthwhile investing, it's true that we won't necessarily get EPDs, especially from the smaller manufacturers. However, of course, EPDs are quite an extensive process. It can be expensive as well and time consuming, and we do not want to exclude smaller manufacturers. So hopefully you know that CIBSE and LETI worked, CIBSE and Elementa, but also Clara and her team worked together, and we produced CIBSE TM65 a year ago, which is a methodology for embodied carbon of building services. And that essentially is 3-tiered. So the first step is, if there's an EPD, ask for an EPD, and if there's one, use it. And then we have 2 other levels of calculation depending on the information that you get, so that you can at least get an estimate of the embodied carbon of your building services product. And really the first level is super basic. It's the main material and the weight, broadly speaking. So it's a very, very simple entry level to get an estimate of your product. This is all about products. We've now also started to build on that guidance, looking at systems as well. So we've already issued a follow-up publication on embodied carbon of residential heating systems, and we're now working on office HVAC systems. So it's just the start. If you have data, do share it with CIBSE if you at all can. It can be anonymous, but we're trying to create a database so that the information can be shared and you don't have to do the calculations too many times. We don't have to ask manufacturers for the same information all the time, etc. Clara, maybe you want to add to that? Or... No. So I'll pick the next questions, which is from Rachel Owens. That's one that comes up quite often, so it's interesting. Energy use intensity targets are based on floor area. Is there an argument to say that this advantages larger dwellings over smaller ones? Should these targets also be related back to occupancy? For example, a couple living in a 200 square meter house are budgeted 4 times the amount of energy compared with a couple living in a 50 square meter flat.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's like, it's useful to have per square meter targets, especially when you're looking at the top down and bottom up target setting, but then in reality, you do need to sense check that. So as I said, LETI is collaborating with CIBSE and UKTPC and others to develop a wider set of energy targets for more typologies, but we're also going to be looking at that, what we're calling secondary metrics. So that depending on the typology, it might be relevant to introduce those secondary metrics. So for homes, it might be per person. And so we need to make sure also that when we need to be clearer when we're saying this is what the target is, what the boundaries of that is. So it might be that there's a, you have 35 kilowatt hours a meter squared, but it might be that you say, okay, that's for buildings that have, or homes that are less than 100 square meters. And for homes that are above, it's a different metric. So I think, yeah, we're on an evolving journey as an industry, and I totally agree with you that we need to think about making sure metrics are important, especially for offices as well. You've got different occupancy, and we definitely want to be incentivizing buildings to be used to the fullness of what they can be used for, and that might mean that office buildings are used more, or there's kind of spaces that flip from being an office during the day and a cafe at night or something. We need to make sure that that's covered, but that will be coming. We'll be thinking about that. So a question for, so there's one that's talking about what level of fit out are we assuming for these targets, and will there be different targets for shell and core, Cat A, fully fitted? How does that work?
So at the moment, no. I don't know whether you're talking about operational or embodied carbon, but at the moment, these are full building targets, both on operational energy and on embodied carbon, with the exception that as per the LETI one-pager on energy use, the most commonly used target is an EUI, but there's also an option, especially for, say, base buildings, to use the neighbors rating. Base buildings are tenanted areas, to use neighbors rating. And in that case, that allows you to make that separation between landlord and tenant areas. We don't yet have separate targets, operational or embodied, for most other building types. Is probably one thing that will be coming, just as we will expand to other sectors, etc. And I will pick the next question. Do you have a case study of a net zero carbon building?
So we know of a lot of buildings that are being developed to achieve the energy targets and the embodied carbon targets. So within a year of releasing the Climate Emergency Design Guide, we knew of over 30,000 homes that were looking to meet the energy use intensity targets, and I think 20,000 homes looking to meet the embodied carbon targets, and same for I think over 1 million square meters of commercial space looking to meet the operational energy and embodied carbon targets. So we know of lots in development that are looking to achieve them. In buildings that have been built, there are buildings that have been built that meet the embodied carbon targets and operational carbon targets separately. I'm not sure if there's been any that have been built and monitored that meet them together, but I'm sure we'll be having them soon. Do you want to add to that, Julie?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's a really good question, and it did, as Clara say, it did contribute to the bottom-up approach. Sometimes people think that when we developed the energy use targets, we only did modeling, but actually we did quite a lot of look at existing buildings. And subsequently, CIBSE looked at all the data from the CIBSE Award. So we published a summary last year of the buildings we have found in the last 10 years of awards that already met or were pretty close to the energy use targets. We published that in the CIBSE journal, and I'm in the process of doing that with the latest batch of award projects. So we keep looking at data that we're getting from buildings already built. As Clara says, often it might only address the energy part or the embodied carbon part, or the embodied carbon part might not have been calculated. So we don't always have the full picture, but we're quite confident that at least in the 3 sectors where we already have these targets, we had on the operational side some case studies that already met them or were not far from meeting them, or we knew why. So for example, some buildings really, if you looked at just their demand alone without the energy networks, they have a very low energy use. It's just that at the moment the network is so energy inefficient and or uses fossil fuels that it doesn't meet the requirements, but the building itself was performing very well. So that was published, and we will have a revisit published in a month or so. Next question is from Helen Mayer. Isn't there a risk that retrofit or decarbonization plans will be promised but not met? Yeah,
I mean, that is true. We want to make sure with some ongoing work that we'll be doing this year on being really clear, further clarification about what a plan needs to have, and we welcome some more guidance on that. We've got to, in order for there to be a plan, does it need to be costed? Does the budget need to be signed off? How does that work? And I think, where does that net zero plan need to be hosted? That net zero plan needs to have a timeline. That means that people can be held to account to it if it's not being met. So I think we do need to be robust in what these plans are. Do you want to add anything to that, Julie?
No, I don't. No, nothing to add. I think it's for you. I stole your pick of the question last, so it's your turn.
No, I guess maybe is it okay, Juliet? There's a few questions that I'm interested in kind of touching upon, and I suppose one of them was the residential embodied carbon targets. So when we first released the targets, we just said, residential targets 500 kilograms of CO2 per square metre. This is how we were defining good in 2020. Then this became the LETI, and then you may have seen that the language we're using for that target is now residential over 6 stories. Now that's because of that kind of clarity of messaging on that. So we realized that the data sets we were using as we were getting closer and closer to kind of robust targets, those data sets, the majority of them were larger buildings. So it was that target is more representative of residential buildings over 6 stories. They're quite easy to get if it's lower rise. So I know that's quite unhelpful because we haven't published targets on low rise, but we're looking to do that soon. But we thought for transparency it was better to have clarity on that.
Mm-hmm. If that's okay, I'll also pick. There's quite a few questions, generally speaking, about the sort of conflicts or trade-off between embodied carbon and operational. So as we've said, we recommend, and the FAQ state that in order to meet net zero whole life carbon, you need to meet both, and that means target both on embodied carbon and on operational carbon. Related to that, there's interesting questions about whether if we introduce requirements such as demand management, we are not going to excessively increase associated embodied carbon. For sure, it's one of the considerations, and we haven't specifically yet looked at things like batteries, but we have looked at, for example, how to address PVs. So PVs have an embodied carbon impact. On the other hand, if that energy is not met by PVs, it will need to be met somehow by the system. So you can't just look at the embodied carbon expenditure of the PVs without looking at what would happen without these PVs in your building. But for sure, we have to be very mindful that if we increase requirements, for example, on demand management, it doesn't have unintended consequences. What we would say, however, and again, that relates to a few of the questions, is it's not necessarily true, and quite often it's not true at all, that the best performing buildings are the most complex and have the most kit in. Actually, we tend to see the opposite. So for example, when we did a study of very low energy buildings in the UK for our government, for the Green Construction Board, 3 years ago, the best performing buildings we found in housing, offices and schools tended actually to be reasonably simple. So not only they had low energy use, but they didn't have that many of these systems, which are very complicated, often do not work well and have a high embodied carbon expenditure. So we are very mindful of not overcomplicating buildings, both for operational and embodied carbon reasons. But for sure, it will be part of our analysis if we start to increase requirements. What does it mean in terms of what we put in the buildings?
Yeah, and LETI are currently running a work stream looking at how you bring operational and embodied carbon together to come up with your whole life carbon calculation, and how that can look to incentivize the right design choices at design stage. So we're putting together an opinion piece on that, and so if you're on the LETI mailing list, you'll get an email when we're launching our paper on that. But that should be done in the next month or so.
Your turn, Cara.
I don't know if we're now answering our own questions or asking each other questions, but I'm going to answer a question on somebody asked, has there been much uptake of LETI targets at a local planning level outside of London? And yes, there has. So West Oxfordshire District Council have an area action plan that's looking to implement the LETI targets, although that's is in draft phase at the moment. There's also policy and draft phase in Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire and Cornwall, who are looking to adopt the LETI approach to the metrics, and some of them are looking at implementing targets, and some of the targets have got a bit more looser targets, but they have swapped to those metrics.
I'll just take a quick one from Tibble Geraldine on again on energy use targets. Can some supplies be excluded from the EUI? For example, offices with many server rooms and associated active cooling. So at the moment, no. There, in terms of if you apply your energy targets in terms of EUIs, we haven't. You just look at all energy uses. We did in the modeling, we did to support these targets include actually a not insignificant allowance for server rooms and associated cooling. Again, it goes back to the question on flexibility for larger or smaller homes, for example, or landlord and tenants, etc. There's a little bit more flexibility in the case of offices if you were to use ratings. So another route in the LETI one-pager is to display energy certificate ratings, and these have separables. It's not necessarily something that this may evolve, because at some point all these separables do have to be accounted for, and we know that actually they can be quite massive, and you can actually see that even at the local area in London where we know there's loads of server rooms, you can see this is a massive part of their emissions. But potentially that route is there in the footnote of the LETI one-pager.
There are a few questions on backup generation. So, is it okay that backup generation has fossil fuels? And I think that's kind of a key one really that we need to work through as an industry, and get consensus and clarity on. I think probably the LETI view would be that you can't, but more work needs to be done in that together. And I know that's so the GBCA, Australian Green Building Council, has just published a really useful guidance on the route to electrification that talks through fossil fuel free ways of having that backup power. So I think that's available on their website.
And I would say that's quite aligned with the CIBSE view as well. There may be a few cases where, at least a few years ago, it was a bit difficult, but we've cautioned quite a lot against this for a while. Also for air quality purposes. At some point, what was supposed to be backup generation ended up, because of unfortunate financial incentives, actually to run quite often. So suddenly we were bringing diesel generation right in the heart of city centers, which let alone carbon for air quality was terrible. So backup generation, if it really is backup for absolutely rare emergency essential reasons, fine, but unfortunately there could be loopholes. And unfortunately, I think that we're really coming to the end, and we might be able to just squeeze in one last question. Clara, if there's one that you really wanted to answer.
It's okay, I thought we were coming to the end anyway.
Yeah, I think we should probably be stopping here. So thank you very much. We have only answered a very small proportion of the questions, but we will look at them. Some of them I think mean future FAQs to be added, and others maybe a bit of clarification, but please download them. You have the links. You will also receive a recording of the email and the links to download. Please circulate, send us your comments, tell us if you want to be involved, and thank you very much. I'll let Clara close the webinar.
I'm just really excited that we've got this far. I really feel like in the last, especially 2-3 years, we're really coming you know, every few months I feel like the industry is coming closer and clarity about what we mean. And I think that, you know, we've got, you know, the latest IPCC report came out recently, and, you know, we've got a lot to, you know, I think we've got now, like, we really need to do a lot with the next 3 years, you know, and that can be really scary. You can be thinking like, oh, we've got to do so much carbon emission reductions. We're in this industry that is carbon intensive, but I feel really positive with days like this, you know, where I think that we are all collaborating together and creating clarity on what we need to do, and building the toolkit to actually delivering on that. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be here with you today, and thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye.